Okay, greetings. Rabbi Griscott here with your sermon recap for yesterday's Parsha, Parshat Shoftim, and some nice news from my family. A little bittersweet for me and Becca personally, but my grandmother, my Bobby Nelly, who some of you have met, made Aliyah, moved to Israel at the age of 90. Really inspiring story that was covered in the Israeli media. She had a film crew following her around, and it went viral on Facebook. A member of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, posted the footage of the Israeli side of the family, my cousins over there, greeting her, wearing masks and playing guitar and singing, and then they even hugged each other through this plastic shield. If you've seen this hugging device, it's very cute. It's a plastic wall with slots for you to put your arm in, and it's a grandparent hugging device where she was hugging each of her Israeli grandkids upon landing in the airport. Really beautiful. My grandmother, who was born in Berlin and moved at the height of the Holocaust. Her father was murdered in the Holocaust. She and her mother, she was an only child, and she moved. They moved to New York together at the age she was 10 years old in 1940. So quite a time to escape Berlin, and she lived in New York City for the next 80 years, and recently of Brooklyn, and recently, the pandemic really kind of shook her up. You know, New York is a bad place to be right now. I mean, a lot of places are a bad place to be, but she decided, my parents live in Israel, my Aunt Dina lives there. The family distribution is kind of even on both sides of the Atlantic, so she decided to move there. But for Becca and me, of course, we're happy for her. We're happy for my parents and my brother who get to have her there now. But of course, we'll get to see her much less, which is why I described it as bittersweet. Truth is, being here in Kansas, we weren't seeing my Bobby so often anyway with her in New York. We last saw her, some of you might have met her exactly a year ago at Ezra's bris. Ezra recently turned 1, and his full name is Avraham Eliezer. We call him Ezra as a nickname on Eliezer, but he's named after my Zaidi, my Bobby Nelly's husband, who died about 15 years ago. So hopefully, maybe, she'll visit once a year and we'll visit once a year, something like that. But as I was thinking of the wisdom of, well, is it right for her to make Aliyah, to move to Israel at this age? I mean, what about the family here? I have two sisters who live here, who live in New York, and cousins in New York. And I realized, like I said, the family distribution is kind of even on both sides. My Bubby has 4 kids, so now my parents moved to Israel. She has 2 kids in Israel, my Aunt Dina also, and 2 kids back in New York. When I was trying to calculate the grandkids, my brother lives in Israel, and it's kind of even. I think she has a few more grandkids in Israel actually. So I decided, all right, we've had her here all these years, let them have her there now in the Holy Land. Anyway, these are just some personal things that have been happening to me and thoughts that I've had this past week. Now, when it comes to yesterday's parsha, in terms of the segues about family and the importance of family. Now, when Israel goes to war, talks about the land of Israel. When you go out to battle against your enemies and you see horses and chariots greater than you shall not fear. It shall be that the Kohen will approach the people. The Kohen, a priest, will get up and speak to the people and say the following: Shema Yisrael. We're used to that phrase, Hear, O Israel. This is a different Shema. Shema Yisrael, atem krevim hayom lamilchama ala ivechem. He shall say to them, Hear, O Israel, today you are coming near to battle against your enemies. Let not your heart be faint. Do not be afraid. Do not panic, and do not be broken before them. Ki Hashem Elokeichem ha'olechem lachem lilachem lechem imo ivechem lahoshia aschem. This is what we say in the prayer for Tzahal, for the IDF, the former prayer for the IDF. We quote this verse: For Hashem your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you, with your enemies to save you. But then the Kohen lists the following 3 exemptions. The following 3 categories of people get to go home and not go out to war. And Maimonides, Rambam, in his Code of Jewish Law, Mishnah Torah, clarifies that these 3 exemptions only apply in a war of choice. That's why it's so important that you need the oral Torah. You can't understand the written Torah without the tradition of the oral Torah. So he says that based on the Talmud. And what is a war of choice? Well, there are 2 kinds. We have this language in English also, interestingly enough. There are 2 kinds of war. There's Melchemet Mitzvah, there's an obligatory war. That's like a defensive war. You're attacked. Well, then you have to go to war. And then all hands are on deck. Every able-bodied adult, men and women, even a bride has to leave her chuppah. The Talmud puts it very dramatically. She's dressed in her white gown, and she hears there's a defensive war, an enemy has attacked Israel. The bride must leave the chuppah to go out to war. The Talmud clarifies it's really the men serve as combatants and the women are helping the war effort, but everyone has to go. And then there's a Milchemet Rashut, which is a war of choice. And that means, for example, you go to war for some greater geopolitical reason. You have an enemy who's not an immediate threat right now, but you might want to preemptively take them out because for whatever purpose. So that's a war of choice can be legitimate in theory, but not everyone has to go. And here are the three exceptions, and they seem kind of random. So, who is the man who has built a new house and has not inaugurated it? Let him go to his house. So, you know, I think if you tried to get out of the army nowadays saying, hey, I just built a new home, I haven't gotten to live in it yet, they'd probably throw you in Leavenworth, which is the army prison right near here in Kansas City. The next one's even more random. Who is the man who has planted a vineyard and not yet redeemed it? Now it's getting really flimsy. I mean, come on, you planted a vineyard and you haven't redeemed it. What that means is in the land of Israel, whenever you plant fruit, you have to let it lie for 3 years. You can't touch it for 3 years. And then in the fourth year, you have this redemption ceremony where you can enjoy the fruit. All right, I haven't gotten to enjoy my vineyard yet. You can go home. Okay. And the third exemption is the one I think we would personally find the most legitimate, the most relatable. Whoever has betrothed a woman and has not yet married her. Okay, so you're engaged to a girl, you haven't gotten married, you can go home and be with your wife and have the wedding. So once again, it's a war of choice, but I was trying to figure out what do these three things represent. If you could turn them into metaphorical, abstract ideas, he who has built a house, that speaks to sort of projects, personal projects that we have. He who has planted a vineyard, that I would file under hobbies, like gardening, right? And he who has betrothed a woman but not yet married her, that's under family. So family, you can go home for important needs of family, hobbies, and projects. Once again, sounds kind of frivolous. Is that legitimate? I think, when we're discussing the difference between an essential war, an obligatory war, and a war of choice, brought to mind for me that during this pandemic, there's been a lot of discussion about what's an essential activity, what's essential workers. Obviously, doctors and nurses are essential. Going to the grocery store, supermarket, that's essential. That has to remain open. But I think it's been an opportunity for me personally and for all of us to really focus on, even when the pandemic ends, okay, what is really an essential activity? And if something is not essential, then that is dafka, that is in particular a time to focus on family, hobbies, and personal projects, which are not frivolous things. I think that's the lesson of the Torah. But I would file that under self care. That's how you realize self actualization. In some ways, those are the most important things in the world. And specifically, as Rambam clarifies, if you're talking about a battle of choice that doesn't really need to be engaged with anyway, look at how compassionate our laws are. If you have to really work on family, hobbies, and projects, it's okay. Go home. We don't need you for this one. And I was telling Becca, even when the pandemic ends, I'm going to try to prioritize, what is an essential battle, so to speak. And if not, and there are so many people who have been trying to focus on goals during this pandemic and complete projects and hobbies. There are people who promised, I'm going to work on my home, while I am home more. I am going to get done the certain, to-do list that I've always had that I've never had time for. Well, those are important things and they're not to be belittled. And I think that's the message of the Parsha yesterday. And even the idea of being engaged but not yet consummated the marriage, I mean, if you take that in an abstract metaphorical sense, there's so much about family that is left incomplete or unconsummated even after you're married. I can imagine someone telling the Kohen, I am married, but I haven't yet achieved shalom bayis. I haven't yet achieved peace in the home. Our relationship needs working on. There's something left unfinished and unconsummated. I think that's the abstract lesson for us to take with us as well. And so I would say that's one of the numerous lessons we should learn from this pandemic. Always ask yourself when you're called to do something that might be a distraction, is this a melchemet mitzvah? Is this an essential battle that I have to embark upon? And if not, figure out how to take care of yourself with that very important self-care, which relates to family, hobbies, projects, and how to improve and actualize yourself. Shavua tov.